Gather round and let me begin my story by saying at the outset that I'm not an attorney. So let the listener of this story beware. I am, after all, what you see, a computer-generated animation. And I'm more than sure that there are many out there that will say that my story is nothing more than a load of crap. On the other hand, I perceive that there are many others that believe that my story is true, at least to one degree or another. So now let me begin. Once upon a time, not so long ago, and in a land not so far away, there arose a new form of auto-repossession ordering in our industry. It was sold to our clients as the end-all to all of their repossession problems. With this new referral service, they could enhance their profits and productivity while reducing manpower, operating costs, and exposure to vicarious liability from wrongful repossessions. The joy of the auto lending industry was enormous. Finally, they cried out, the gods of finance and usury have sent to us a champion to shield us from the wrath of the great unwashed masses and their evil Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The only obstacle that lay across their path was the professional repo men of the repossession industry, who had to be forced to do the bidding of the new repo referral services, which became known as the forwarders. They had to be forced to accept far less in pay for their services while assuming all of the risk for theirs and the actions of the forwarders who would hire them. Or, should I more accurately say, enslave them. After all, these forwarders reasoned, these repo men were nothing more than a bunch of tow truck drivers. They should be paid as such. Besides that, they said, they're the ones doing the repos, so they should have all of the liability, even if we, the forwarder, order a wrongful repossession. We can do that, you see, because we're not subject to the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act like the repo man is, since we're not debt collectors. The forwarders claimed to be nothing more than repossession management referral services or collection adjustment facilitators or UFO anal probing assistance services or whatever title they wanted to bestow upon themselves. It made no difference, just so long as no one called them debt collectors. And because their banking clients no longer hired the actual repo man directly, their client lenders felt sure that they were now shielded from any liability. When the banking clients began to ask questions about the legality of all of this, the forwarders said, "Hey banks, don't worry, we've got your backs. Besides, you can pass on all of our costs that we charge you directly back to the consumer's outstanding credit balance." Well, the banks saw a huge win from their newfound champion forwarder. In the past, they could only charge off to the consumer the repo man's fee. But now, they could do away with their entire collection departments, saving all of that cash, and then pass the entire bill of the forwarders directly to the consumer. Soon they realized that not only could they pass on all of the cost of their forwarder middleman to the already indebted consumer, but could do so with compounding interest. Well, needless to say, the banking compliance managers learned that it was indeed better not to ask any questions. As for the professional repo men, they did begin to complain that this was unfair and not right and probably illegal. The forwarders heard their sniveling and whining and said, "Shut up and stop your complaining. We now control 80% of your industry's entire market and all of your major clients. You work for us now, at whatever price we set, and if you don't like it, we'll destroy you." Well, many of the brave repo men took this as a challenge and even a threat, so the forwarders went after them to set an example of their might that was bestowed upon them by the gods of finance and usury. Before long, the battlefield of dead and dying repo men that had been cut asunder for challenging the forwarders was overflowing. Over half of these once brave repo men that were licensed, trained, and professional were no more. Those that were left were few and scattered, and would take whatever assignments they could just to keep from starving. Now the bankers, they knew of this, but could seem to care less. After all, they were being stuffed with cash, and in their greed they wanted even more. So they crafted new ways to finance cars in the subprime market, and as the consumers defaulted at an ever-increasing rate, they would pass their orders for repossession to their forwarder champions. Unfortunately, the forwarders had killed so many of the professional repo men, there were no longer enough of them left to fill the demand for all the repo orders. So they began to hire tow truck drivers and tow truck companies and towing service companies and even some guy named Joe Bob who happened to have a tow truck in his backyard. Now I'm sure you can just imagine what happened next. In no time at all, as they say, things went south. Many of these wannabe repo men tow truck drivers had no idea what they were doing. They didn't possess the training or the basic certifications to do auto repossessions. They didn't have the right equipment, the right bonding, insurance, or in some cases, even a license to operate as a repossessor. Not that that seemed to make any difference to the forwarders. Soon there were increases in violence with debtors. There were lawsuits and wrongful repossessions, breaches of peace, and much, much more. It was so bad that Hollywood began to produce cable TV series featuring these untrained, unlicensed, and unprofessional repo clowns at work. It made the entire industry into one big circus joke. Eventually, the banking clients of the forwarders began to worry about their exposure to possible liability, especially in light of CFPB enforcement decisions, which said that the CFPB would hold bankers responsible for the actions of their contractors. The forwarders, seeing the worry of their banking clients, told them that they, the forwarders, were not debt collectors and were not therefore accountable to anyone, even the dreaded CFPB. So not to worry, they said. But to make sure, we'll establish a CFPB compliance program which all of our vendor repo agents must comply to do work for us. And if they don't comply, then they're out. Well, the poor professional repo man was now forced with complying with all of the forwarders' dreamed up CFPB requirements. This was strange to the repo men, considering that they were already regulated, as were the banking clients of the forwarders. It was the middleman forwarders who were claiming immunity from all of the consumer protection laws, and yet it was they who were demanding the repo man not only be compliant, but compliant in the manner that they, the forwarder, demanded. What was even worse, as professional repo men, they were already forced to prove their compliance to the trade associations, insurance companies, bonding agents, and state licensing authorities, and now they had to deal with all of these forwarder demands. And each one of them had a different format for asking the same questions. Of course, all were costly to complete, and the cost for all their compliance documentation was borne by the already beleaguered repo man. When the repo man requested some kind of compensation to pay for all this added administrative burden, he was told, "If you do what we say, we may just give you some more orders, and we may even pay you at a price that you got 10 years ago. Heck, we might even throw in a few extra dollars for rekeying, so shut up and do it or else." Well, those few professional repo men that had been beaten into submission did all they could to comply with the demands of these forwarders. And as time passed, even more of them starved to death or were destroyed. But after a time, the repo men had had enough and could take no more. They began to meet in secret with attorneys, government officials, and each other to devise a plan to defeat the forwarders and take back their industry. Unfortunately, some repo men were discovered by the forwarders and were ordered to cease under the threat of being starved to death. But fearlessly they continued in their planning. Others became hired quislings of the forwarders and spied on their fellow repo men with the dangling promises of riches and fame. But like the professional true repo men that they were once, they persisted in their pursuit to take back what had been taken from them. Finally, there came forth one of the wisest of all repo men. He began to question as to why these forwarders would be willing to spend millions of dollars to avoid being legally defined as debt collectors. I mean, what was the big deal, he said to himself. And then it came to him that if the forwarders were debt collectors under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, specifically as defined in Section 803, Paragraph 6, then they would be subject to all of the Act, as well as the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the Banking Services Company Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, and a host of other laws, both state and federal. And after many hours of studying the books of law and wisdom in the dank library of knowledge, he found that in the opinions of many courts, it was ruled that these forwarders were indeed debt collectors. So the wise repo man asked himself, "So saith the court in the king's law, the forwarders are, and have always been, debt collectors." But these revelations mean nothing. So what? What had they done that violated any of these or any other consumer protection laws? Well, he thought to himself, you could possibly say that they had violated many times over the Sherman Antitrust Act and engaged in predatory pricing and conducting repossession operations without a license as required in many states. But who would care, he said to himself. After all, these were nothing more than matters of the repo forwarder versus the repo man. Well, there must be something here to all of this, or why would they fight so hard not to be defined as debt collectors? Well, wasn't this entire business model crafted to provide immunity to the banking clients from vicarious liability that could arise from a wrongful repossession? Well, that's probably true, he reasoned to himself. You could possibly say that this has resulted in consumers being denied their right to sue predatory automobile lenders for breach of peace. Well, that's probably true too, he said to himself. You could say that these forwarders have created an oligopoly to control not only the recovery industry but the used car market as well. That seems awful true too, he said to himself. You could say that they've increased consumer indebtedness. After all, why is it that the repo man is only getting paid what he was a decade ago, yet the consumer is being billed for far more? Well, that's probably true too, he whispered to himself. You could say that they have fostered an air of public endangerment, not to mention the danger posed to the sharing of consumer information and the erosion of consumer protections in auto lending. Well, he said to himself, this seems to be very interesting. Now, after some digging in his notes, he realized that in the section of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act entitled Communications with Third Parties, it specifically delineated whom debt collectors, as these forwarders are, may communicate. And among all of those listed in this section, communicating with a subcontracted collection agency, repossession agency, or Joe Bob, the tow truck guy, are not listed, nor are allowed. And any contravention of the Act may be punishable under Section 813 entitled Civil Liability. In addition, he realized that inasmuch as these forwarders are debt collectors who work as first-tier direct contractors to the bank under the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, they are considered affiliated financial institutions and as such cannot transmit consumer information without the direct consent of the consumer. In all of his study, the wise repo man could not find anywhere where a forwarder was allowed to transmit an order for repossession to any repossessor or towing company or otherwise. It is no wonder that these forwarders are so keen on not being defined as debt collectors. But it would seem that they never realize that under the law, it is not what title you give yourself that defines you, but what you do. So, if they were actually debt collectors all along, how is it that the entire forwarder business model can even exist? Well, the short answer, as he surmised, is it can't, and it never should have. Now, armed with this knowledge, the wise repo man went to visit the learned monks in the monastery of St. Law of Justice to ask if his reasoning of the law was indeed correct. After a long review of the wise repo man's notes by the brothers of the monastery, finally the abbot of the monastery, a noted expert on such matters of the law, walked from the dimly lit scriptorium into the great hall where the wise repo man stood waiting for an answer. The old abbot stood before him and said in his old cracked voice, "Your findings and conclusions are righteous to all who know the truth. Woe be unto the banks, for you are righteous. After the collapse of 2008, the law sent unto the banks a race of great men called the regulation compliance managers. But they too have become corrupted by the greed. It would have been better for they to have hired Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, or even Vito Genovese to handle their repossessions than these forwarders. For now the banks can be held responsible for hiring these forwarders, whom the courts have held are debt collectors, and therefore subject to the law as such. Oh, woe be unto the banks." "Well, Brother Abbot, what should I do?" asked the wise repo man. And the old abbot said, "The only force great enough to bring this wrong to right, to bring balance to that which has become unbalanced, to jail those who are too big to jail, is the great giant named Government Regulator, who lives in the Valley of the Jolly in the land of Washington. It is said that he wields a great and mighty war club that all finance companies, bankers, and lenders fear. It is called the CFPB. Go there and seek him out." And so the wise repo man thanked the abbot and the monks of the monastery of St. Law of Justice, and left to journey to the Valley of the Jolly in the land of Washington to seek out the great giant government regulator. Now most of the repo men that he knew were long since dead or had to turn to the dark side of the force in order to eke out a living as a slave in bondage. So he had to make the journey on his own and in secret, so as not to arouse the suspicion of the forwarders, who would try any means to stop him from reaching Washington. So the wise repo man traveled to the Valley of the Jolly in the land of Washington to seek out the great giant government regulator by himself and without any assistance from anyone. After a long and perilous journey, he finally reached the Valley of the Jolly in the land of Washington. He was so happy that he'd made it that he began to dance a dance of happiness and joy. And after only a short time, he found the great, well-fed giant government regulator sleeping off a large meal of appropriations under the shade of an equally great in size tree that grew precariously from the side of a cliff. The wise repo man tried all he could to awaken the sleeping giant and tell him of his story, but to no avail. Finally, he began to hurl rocks at the giant and beat a large drum and sound a ram's horn right in his ear. And finally he awoke and rose to his feet, scratching himself.
"Who are you to awaken me?"
"I'm a repo man that's lost almost everything to the forwarders."
"Oh yes, so sad, too bad. Go away."
"You don't understand, these forwarders." And the giant cut him off and boomed out in his giant voice,
"I don't care. No one cares. You're a repo man, and no one likes you. Not even your former banking clients that abandoned you to the forwarders. So who cares if the big bad forwarder repo companies stomp on you and all of your little repo buddies?"
Well, the wise repo man snapped back. "Now you listen to me," he shouted. "These are consumer issues, and I'm a consumer, and you're a consumer, and my next door neighbor is a consumer. Yeah, they're destroying me and my friends, I'll grant you, but they're also destroying all of us and our consumer protection laws as well." Well, the giant began to wonder if there was more to this than what he had been led to believe by the banking industry's paid lobbyist. And after thinking for a moment, the giant said,
"Well, if what you say is true, then the only one who can complain is someone who has standing. Have you had your car repossessed lately?"
And the wise repo man said, "Why, no."
"Then you can't sue under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. You have to have standing. Are you the federal government?"
"Well, no," responded the wise repo man. Then the giant said,
"You can't bring a private action under the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. So like I said, I'm sorry. Now go away."
"No," yelled the wise repo man, "I won't go." Well, by now the giant was getting a little irritated, but knew that the wise repo man was onto something, and although he didn't want to get involved, the repo man was very persistent. "I know that your mighty war club, the one that you call the CFPB, can do something if you want it to," shouted the wise repo man.
"Well, that's true, but so far, out of all of the consumers in the King's Land, you're the only one who has come forth and complained. If you find someone who has standing, I'll listen and maybe do something. I'll tell you what, repo man, if you promise to let me go back to sleep, I'll consider releasing my CFPB if someone who represents consumers, you know, like a consumer rights group or a local state or government official, who will write a letter of complaint on behalf of the consumers they represent, or perhaps a consumer that has had their personal information released. Now, if they file a lot of complaints, and there's enough of them to make it worth my while, then I may release my war club on these forwarders. So until then, go away."
So the giant returned to his comfortable lair in the shade, and laid back down and soon began to snore a loud and giant snore, And the wise repo man returned to his office in his own land and began a campaign to get the people involved and to make and sign petitions and to write letters of complaint to the CFPB and the Federal Trade Commission and to send emails and make phone calls to their elected officials and to all the consumer rights groups, government, consumer protection agencies, and many others, spreading the word so that the sleeping giant will again awaken and release his dreaded CFPB. And so, my friends, I cannot say that this story will have a happy ending, and all of the professional repo men will arise yet again and take back and make right their once prosperous industry of professionals. So I will simply say the end of this story awaits to be written. So if you'd like to help out the wise repo man and your industry in awakening the sleeping giant of our government, send a letter demanding that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau take immediate action against these debt collector forwarders for their abuse of our consumer laws. And if you do, well, I guess that'll make you a wise repo man too. Just send your letter to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, 1700 G Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20552.